everybody. Next segment we have is Tom Juravich. Tom Juravich is a professor of labor studies and sociology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, who writes regularly about work and the labor process, labor and working class culture, and union organizing. He is the author of Commonwealth of Toil, Ravenswood, and Altar of the Bottom Line. He's also a singer and songwriter. Jorvich's new melody and arrangement for Bread and Roses appears on the Healy and Jorvich CD, Tangled in Our Dreams, released in 2006. And again, after Tom, after he has his lecture, we'll have questions that he can answer at the end of his lecture. So you want to take it away, Tom?
Yes, it looks like you'll have to enable my video, however.
Sorry about that, Tom. It should be enabled, but let me, yep, I think it's on your end that,
Nope, it says host has stopped it.
Well, sorry about that. Let me try this again. Well, I'm not sure why that's happening, Tom, but let me keep trying to change it on my end.
The fun little excitement about working with Zoom.
I'm going to try to change you to an attendee and then bring you back in, and maybe that'll fix it. Nothing, huh?
Yeah, it says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
Yeah, it says the same for me too.
Well, that's something new. Did that fix it? Yay. Okay. We've got...
There we go.
I'm so sorry about that.
No worries. Good afternoon, everyone. It was so wonderful to be here with you today. And I'd like to start with a verse. As we come marching, marching in the beauty of the day, a million darkened kitchens and 1,000 mill-offs gray are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses. For the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses. So that's the first verse to Bread and Roses, one of the labor classics, along with songs like Solidarity Forever or We Shall Not Be Moved or Which Side Are You On? Bread and Roses is known as one of the most famous American labor songs. Yet the route that it's traveled is so different from songs like Solidarity Forever, written in the same year as Bread and Roses. Solidarity Forever was always a part of the American labor movement. And even though verses have been changed and verses dropped and arrangements made of the song, Ralph Chaplin, who wrote the song, would recognize a version today. But the story is very different. And what I'd like to do is to trace that very different story of the road that Bread and Roses took from an early poem all the way to today. Now, I'd like to show my screen here, and let's see. Okay, Bread and Roses. Now, our conventional wisdom is that the song Bread and Roses came from a banner that women held during the 1912 Lawrence strike. And the first place that was really argued was in Upton Sinclair's book called The Cry of Justice from 1915. And he said in that volume, he said, in a parade of the strikers in Lawrence, some young women carried a banner inscribed, "We want bread and roses too." And this was put alongside the poem by James Oppenheim, who, by the way, was featured in other parts of A Cry for Justice. Later on in 1964, in Joyce Kornbluth's very well-known book called Rebel Voices, an IWW anthology, she writes, James Oppenheim's poem, Bread and Roses, was inspired by one of the 1912 Lawrence strike parades, in which the young girls carried a banner, "We want bread and roses too." Well, the truth is, if you look at Jim Zwick and other work that's been done historically, it turns out that James Oppenheim's poem, Bread and Roses, was written and published months before the Lawrence strike. So it was not inspired based on Lawrence. The question then becomes for historians is, was that song or was that phrase used during the Lawrence strike? And one of the reasons we've had a lot of people have been committed to that is that one of the IWW organizers, Giovannetti, who was also a poet, wrote a song called Pani Rosa. And if you look at the literature, it's assumed that that's the Italian version of Bread and Roses, and that it was sung in Lawrence during that time period. Well, I actually found this songbook. It's actually an ILG songbook from 1940. It was one of a series of songbooks published by the ILGWU. And here are the lyrics for Pani Rosa. And you can see here, shout the message to the breezes far and wide, and to each neighbor, hail the voice and soul of labor, hail our local 89. Rally, comrades, arise and forward. On the morrow we shall see bread and roses, song and laughter, won by solidarity. This is a song written about his later work with the ILGWU. It's not a song about Lawrence. It's really not a song about bread and roses. It happens to have the phrase bread and roses, but doesn't really refer back to Lawrence. And if you look at the work of Gerald Sider and others, we have actually no evidence that the phrase bread and roses or that this banner was actually ever used during the Lawrence strike. So the question now becomes, you know, bread and roses is this incredibly powerful idea and theme, right? It is so powerful that many people have used it in many different contexts. And labor historian Artis Cameron, who's written a beautiful book about Lawrence called Rebels of the Worst Sort, in later writing, she noted that it doesn't really matter if this was actually a phrase used during the strike, if it becomes now a concept that we can use to elevate women's participation in the Lawrence struggle. So I want to leave that there, and I do not want to be the person talking about there is no Christmas or no Easter bunny. But more importantly, what I want to do in the rest of my time is I want to trace the song Bread and Roses through labor and American history. The song Bread and Roses, well, first let's talk about where the idea of bread and roses came from. In the 1980s, a number of people got together and rebranded the strike in Lawrence the Bread and Roses strike. Here you see that beautiful painting by Ralph Massanella. It has its roots in the work that Paul Cohen did in the Village Voice, and he later brought together Mo Foner from the 1199 Bread and Roses Foundation, Bill Kahn, and actually in April 27th of 1990, they held Bread and Roses Day in Lawrence. And Peter and Paul and Mary sang Bread and Roses at that event. And that linkage to Bread and Roses likely came from Kornbluth's book. And again, the point is not that it never happened in Lawrence. The question now becomes, what was the history of this song and where did it go? The first place we saw Bread and Roses appear was in the Rebel Songbook, published by the Rand School, a socialist school with connections to the ILG and the clothing workers in New York City. In 1935, they published a song called Bread and Roses with music by Martha Coleman. And the music is pretty straightforward and plain. The melody goes like this. As we come marching, marching in the beauty of the day, a million darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill lofts gray, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses, for the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses. So that was the first appearance of the song based on Oppenheim's poem in 1935. It also appeared in the ILG songbook called Knowledge is Power. And again, if you look at the iconography of both of these songbooks, these are workers in struggles, almost a socialist realist iconography here, looking up to the knowledge is power. And another important song from that period is the labor songbook that was published by the textile workers. And this was a song that was compiled by Sophia Horton, who was part of the Highlander School. And she compiled this songbook. It was 64 songs. They were largely political songs. And here you see workers in front of a factory speaking about struggle, wanting to be part of this. And this is a beautiful songbook that's part of this first generation of labor songbooks that speak to song being part of struggle. In fact, in the back cover of the songbook, there's a quote from John L. Lewis, mine workers president of the CIO. And he writes, excuse me, a singing army is a winning army, and a singing labor movement cannot be defeated. Songs can express sorrow as well as triumph, but the fact that a man is singing shows that his spirit is still free and searching, and such a spirit will not submit to
Thank you so much.
This was what Lewis saw as the power of song, as exemplified in these early 1930s songbooks. But the world changed. The world changed after World War II. We saw the passage of Taft-Hartley, which John L. Lewis called the first face of fascism in America. And it required union leaders to sign non-communist affidavits. And with McCarthyism, much of the labor movement broke ties with the left and the progressive part of the labor movement. And this beautiful songbook that was filled with political labor songs that Horton had put together from Highlander was replaced by this songbook. And it's interesting, you just see from the cover a very different iconography. Here are happy workers singing songs. These are not workers in struggle. And if you look at the contents of the songbook, more than half of the songbook is not made up of labor songs. And for the first time, we saw the emergence of labor songbooks that included Americana songs. You Are My Sunshine, Home on the Range, I've Been Working on the Railroad. And in this expression that somehow the labor movement was part of this new America, this new melting pot. We saw a very similar, in fact, probably the same author drew the cover of the CIO songbook from the Department of Education and Research. And that songbook too was filled with popular songs. And this again is hardly a worker in struggle, a cartoon. Here's the Steelworkers Songbook from 1950 with sort of a caricature of a barbershop quartet on the cover. And the inspiration in the back of this songbook, very different from John L. Lewis's. They say, to all steelworkers who enjoy singing, this small book is dedicated. Really very interesting to see this transformation from singing as part of a political struggle to singing as enjoyment, singing as something that we do, and that we sing songs not that are about the divisiveness on the factory floor and the plant, but that are all about bringing people together. Interesting also to note that none of these songs were songs that came from the African American community. These were not songs that came from the Black experience. These were white songs, largely English and Irish songs that were part of this new labor canon, replacing this older political tradition. This is one of my favorite covers. This was the first songbook of the AFL-CIO after they merged in 1959. This book came out in 1960. And again, gone are the workers struggling, singing in front of the plant gates. And what do we see here? We see men mostly in jackets and ties singing. This is not at a picket line. This appears to be at a union meeting, at a rally. Labor was now respectable, and this was showing that respectability. And this is exemplified by the emergence of someone who was called labor's troubadour, Joe Glazer. Joe Glazer, who was a rabid anti-communist, replaced Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, the Almanac Singers, the Weavers, those people on the left who were singing those political songs. And instead, Joe Glazer was invited to sing at union events. In fact, in this songbook, if you open up to the middle of the songbook, there is yet to have been a labor song. And the first song is not a traditional labor song, but it's one of Joe Glazer's songs called "The Mill Was Made of Marble." In some ways, this was Joe's model, that what singing was about was entertaining at union events, at union dinners. His songs were often humorous and enjoyable, and this was the new idea of labor music, an enjoyable thing that people in respectable organizations sang at respectable union events. And what we see here is that union culture by the early 1960s was a shadow of its former self, a shadow of the political activity it had been in the 1930s and 40s. And Bread and Roses, the song, had disappeared. It was not included in any of these feel-good Americans labor songbooks of the 1950s. It just was not there. And at this point, it looked as though that not only was union culture on a road to nowhere, but the song Bread and Roses would be left behind. And it would have been left behind with the exception if it had not been for the American women's movement. Bread and Roses was born again in the feminist movement of the 1960s. We heard earlier today a presentation by the Bread and Roses about the Bread and Roses Collective in Boston. Bread and Roses was the name of many books and many programs. And it became reborn as a labor song. How? Well, Martha Coleman's melody had long been forgotten. Judy Collins, the singer, knew the poem Bread and Roses, but was unaware that any music had been sent to it. And her friend was Mimi Farina, who was Joan Baez's sister. And when Mimi lost her husband in a motorcycle accident, she had started the Bread and Roses Foundation in California. And it was a program that brought music into prisons. And she sent Mimi the poem Bread and Roses. And Mimi Farina wrote a new melody. And Judy Collins recorded it in 1976. It was her title cut of her Grammy award-winning best-selling record. And that's the melody we know that I started with. As we come marching, marching in the beauty of the day. And what Mimi Farina had done is turned it into an anthem. And it became an anthem of the women's movement. In fact, the way that the song was written, which in some ways kept it out of some labor songbooks, was perfect for the feminist movement. And it became an anthem of the women's movement. And it came back to the labor movement. And I can hardly say that it came back because in many ways it wasn't in the labor movement. It was gone from the labor movement for more than several decades. This is the songbook from the AFL from 1983. Gone are the men in suits. Here, a young woman with a guitar. And the first page of the songbook, if we were to open it up, is the song Bread and Roses, as if it had always been there as part of the labor canon. And Bread and Roses came back to the labor movement, as did many other songs in this collection, as part of new social movements that were growing. New social movements within labor that were speaking about union democracy, that were fighting plant closings, that were bringing an awareness about safety and health into the workplace and into the labor movement. And this song in the women's movement rode that wave of new activism. And this songbook has a number of feminist songs in it. So that we have to credit the feminist movement with saving, holding on to the song, recasting it, and then bringing it back into the labor movement where it always was, or at least where it started. And I'd like to close this presentation and look forward to your questions and discussion by noting that Bread and Roses was also chosen the name of a Hollywood movie, which didn't look at New England mills. It looked at undocumented women in the cleaning services building. This was modeled after the Justice for Janitors campaign in California. So the Bread and Roses has been born again in a new movement of immigrants fighting for social justice. It's also been part of a number of rearrangements of the song, new lyrics, new arrangements. And in this way, Bread and Roses, the song, has never been more alive. In some ways, because it was never traditionally welded to a melody. In some ways, I think it's created a lot more creativity around this. So Bread and Roses is now part of the labor canon. It took a very circuitous route to be there, but it is now one of the labor classics and will be there for a long time to come. Thank you. I look forward to your questions. Denise, I can't hear you.
Denise, you're muted.
Sorry. No, I was just saying mutedly that I think thank you so much for bringing this up, because I feel like when people think about activism, they think about going out, holding a sign, marching, or something like that. But this is another tool in which people are using, you know, to share their voice, to spread information. I think, and it has happened throughout history. It's not just today, or, you know, I know, you know, it's been happening throughout history. So I appreciate you bringing that up and stuff. So if anybody has questions, I know we have Thomas who says, can I buy the songbook around here? So I'm assuming the Merrimack Valley.
I don't know what songbook he's speaking of. You can, Pete Seeger and Bob Reiser's book called Carried On is still in print. It includes Bread and Roses is in that songbook. That's a great place. You can get that song, and there are other songbooks available as well. And Denise, I want to just go back to your comment, because it is true. I mean, we think of movements sometimes as, you know, organizations, but, you know, labor movements have always had their cultural side. If we think of the American Civil Rights Movement, if we think of that battle for justice for janitors, you know, which is really a Latino struggle in Southern California. I mean, movements have always had culture, and song and dance and poetry and theater are part of that. And I think it's so important that, you know, as you're doing in Lawrence today, to celebrate this culture. And that this culture is not just frozen in time. This is not a song, a story about a song frozen in 1912. It's a song that's still about coming and becoming and being reinvented.
Definitely. We have a question from David Goodman. He says, Tom, to what extent did companies/corporations support the publishing of the watered down songbooks in the 50s and 60s?
That's a really great question. And I don't think they had any role. It was really interesting that what we saw was that, you know, these new education departments that were formed after the war and in the 1950s printed these materials. And they also printed, the UAW, for example, had a guide to recreation, you know, and part of their guide to recreation said, hold sing-alongs, have people sing, get a piano. And so I don't know that this was a corporate effort, but it really was this effort of moving the American labor movement away from the left and away from that history, which was filled with struggle, into now much more consensus-based, in many ways, not a labor movement anymore, because it had lost its culture. This was now a labor institution. And we were all going to be well behaved in this new labor relations system where we'd file grievances instead of going out on strike. And that was the way the labor movement got denuded. And partly this had amazing consequences, deleterious consequences, when in the 1980s, when the world changed and labor needed to fight again, a lot of that institutional memory had been lost during that post-war era.
We also have a question from Jim, who asked, if you know how Mo Fauner's organization chose the name Bread and Roses.
You know, that's a very good question. And that was something I've been looking at in the last couple of weeks. And the answer is, I don't know the answer to that question. I believe that Mo, like a number of the other people, had read Joyce Kornbluth's book and thought that, you know, Bread and Roses had come out of the Lawrence strike. And that's why, and he saw that inspiration, which is why he called that project the Bread and Roses foundation. But I really don't know the answer to that, and that would be a good thing for an historian to take a peek at.
Yeah. But back, I don't know, I just love the idea of how powerful music can be, and how, you know, it can affect, just, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that this is also a call right now. I mean, I think we're seeing the labor movement grow in new different kinds of ways, in embracing worker centers, the whole teacher education movement, bargaining for the common good. We're seeing a lot of activity right now, and for me, part of this has also got to be a cultural activity. This is about rebuilding this connection with our own culture and our own roots.
And we have another question. One last question, I'll say, because time's almost running out. Let's see, hold on, sorry. So how much do you think the folk movement of the 60s have to do with bringing these songs back into popular consciousness?
That is a fantastic question. And it's really interesting. The AFL continued to publish songbooks up until 1974 as if the whole folk song revival hadn't happened. But as your question indicates, I think that the folk song revival, I mean, that's what I came to. That's how I learned labor songs, was through that. And that was a big way in which, and the labor movement was slow in responding to that. But I think that kept those songs alive. And Bread and Roses was one of those songs that was kept alive by the folk movement until there was a time when the women's movement was able to ride that wave to bring it back into the labor movement.
Denise, great section today. You and Thomas, fantastic. Thomas, I just wanted to add that one of the Wobblies who came to Lawrence, one of the most prominent ones, Big Bill Haywood, called the Lawrence strike the singing strike.
Mm-hmm.
So that was certainly song, music, that was a part of the Lawrence strike heritage then, and as you have so very brilliantly told us today, remained so to the present day. So thank you so much for your presentation today.
Thank you very much. We'll see you all soon. Okay.
Also wanted to add, you have a great voice.
Thank you.
Really great voice.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm gonna hand it off to you, Hartley, to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Denise. Great job, and that was certainly a great segment. And we thank you, and we thank Mr. Jorvich for participating today.